Okay, bottom of Lamadal and Abiz. 6 lines from the bottom of the page. So yesterday we were in the middle of discussing differences between prat uklal prat and miyut and riboy. We said that the general rule was that in the scenario of miyut and riboy, so the miyut, the less inclusive term, is first, then the riboy, the more inclusive term. So the riboy is sort of in some small way limited by the miyut, by the limited term. So the fact that limited term is first limits the more expansive term. And the way it was applied to Nazir is first the Torah lists a bunch of specific examples of Nazir, like wine and vinegar and grapes and raisins. And then the Torah says, anything that comes out of a vine. That's the more inclusive term. And then the Torah concludes with mechartzanim va'adzag, from peels and pits. Now, according to Rabbi Lazar, peels and pits does not constitute a miyut. Why doesn't it constitute a miyut? We'll explain very shortly. Okay, so therefore you have what he calls a riboy, and then a miyut, and then a riboy. A miyut is more specific terms, followed by a riboy, more generic terms. The miyut limits the riboy in some way. So what does it limit? It limits shabishta, limits branches. However, the Rabbanan say that it's a prat to klal prat. What does that mean? So if you have a prat followed by a klal, meaning you have a specific term, right? Wine, grapes, raisins, vinegar, strong wine, followed by a generic term, that's mikosh and anything that comes off vine. The generic term is considered an addition on the prat, on the specific term, and it includes everything. So if you have a prat to klal, the klal, the generic term, becomes moisif ala prat. It becomes an addition to the specific. However, if the Torah follows the generic term with a specific term of prat, the prat limits the generic term. So we said what it does is it takes the klal, the generic term, instead of saying it's as generic as it can be, we say you take all the pratim, throw it into a basket, and the definition that holds that basket is called the klal. So in other words, typically a klal generic term would be kol she'etz megefen, would include everything, even the branches, the wood, everything is included. Now that we have specific terms, we have chartzanim and zag, peels and pits, plus we have wine, strong wine, vinegar of both products, grapes and raisins. Take a basket that holds all of those. What's a basket that holds all of those? Pre-upsel is pre. The fruit and its waste product, i.e. vinegar. So it's got to be a fruit-related product is the message. And that's the basket, so to speak. In other words, we're taking a generic term from being everything that into being, it's got to be fruit-related. That's the basket. Okay, so we'll continue the Gemara, and then later today we discuss a lot of the fundamentals of prat uklal prat. Yeah, should be interesting. Okay. So Amar, this is repeating the Gemara yesterday. We'll go through it a little quickly. Ima hapram before is pre-gomer, af kol pre-gomer. Okay, so in other words, how do we define the klal? We have a prat, a klal, a prat. Prat, what is the first specific term? What is it? It's wine, vinegar, grapes, raisins. That's a prat. Klal, generic term, what is that? Kol asher yotzei megefen hayayin. Anything that leaves the grapevine. And then we have a further prat, further specification, chartzanim and zag, peels and pits. Okay, so we're saying what's the common denominator? Pre-gomer. Pre-upsel is pre and the waste product. Why don't we just say it's pre-gomer? It's regular fruit. It's avkol pre-gomer. Amrit, we can't say that. Imkein ma'aniach hakosav mashmoy shlei omru anov mlachim yiveshim shlei omru. We can't say it includes just a regular fruit. In other words, the grapes and healthy fruit that are edible. Because if that's the case, then what addition is there? What is the klal coming to include? Everything we know. Anov mlachim yiveshim haksivi yayin v'chayim etzaksivi. You know, what are the products of fruit? Grapes and raisins, wine and vinegar. Those are all written. So obviously the klal isn't coming to include anything. So therefore, the appropriate category to be a little bit more expansive is pre-upsilis pre. Fruit and its waste product. It's called over. Now that we're including everything, in other words, so now that we're making a more expansive category, so why did the Torah need to write Chartzanim and Zag? To tell you as follows: whenever you have a prat followed by a klal, when you have a specific term followed by a generic term, we say that the generic term includes everything. You can't limit it to the specific term. We say the klal, the generic term, is in addition to the specific term. Unless afterwards the Torah specifies just like it does by Nazir. In other words, the reason why the Torah needs to say Mechatzanav Adzag is to tell you to use the rule of klal prat to klal. Prat to klal of prat, I'm sorry. Prat for me. Okay.
Say that real fast sometimes.
We saw this yesterday. Repeat it. Again, the question here is what is the source? Where do we see the Torah uses the framework of prat uklal prat? Prat uklal prat. Yeah. So the answer is Nazir teaches you that the critical component of prat uklal prat is that there's a prat at the end. In other words, because Chartzanim and Zag would have been included anyway. It's part of the fruit. It would have been included using the methodology of, in other words, let's say we say that instead of prat to klal prat, the same rule would apply if you have a prat to klal. In other words, you have a prat followed a specific term followed by a generic term. We say the specific term governs the use of the generic term, even if there's no prat at the end. So if that's the case, then we would say that the Torah first says prat, right? Wine, grapes, raisins, vinegar. Then it says klal, kol asher yotze migef hayayin. Okay, we would have said if the prat, the specific terms define the klal, the generic term, we would say that any product of the fruit is included, and therefore chartzanim and zag would be included as well. So why did the Torah need to write chartzanim and zag? To tell you that no. When you have a prat to klal, a specific term followed by a generic term, the specific term does not define the generic term. The generic term is considered in addition to the specific term. So we would say that there's wine, vinegar, grapes, raisins, plus anything that comes out of a vine, including the woods. And that's what the Torah has to say. No, chartzanim and zag at the end. Another specification. To tell me that the rule of prat to klal prat should be applied here, and not if you just have a prat followed by a klal. If you have a prat followed by a klal, they're considered two separate units. They don't touch each other. Together? Okay. Mechartzanim va'adzag. I'm sorry, okay. The Torah here concludes with the specific statements of peels and pits. Okay. Okay, so we saw in the Mishnah, it's a unique opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. Let's say a guy has a cup full of grape peels. According to Rabbi Elazar, he is not liable. The only liability is if you eat at least 2 peels and 1 pit. Because the Torah used the word chartzanim, which is peels in plural, it's a plural terminology, and zag is a seed, but a seed is used in single terminology. It's 1 seed. So Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says you're only chayiv if you eat a kazayas, but at a minimum, if you're eating peels or pits, at a minimum it must include at least 2 peels and 1 pit. Okay, well, if that's the case, then chartzanim and zag is not a prat. It's a specific law. It's not coming to tell you anything about the klal and the prat. It's just coming to say that you have to eat 2 peels and a pit. It shouldn't be considered a prat because the Torah needed to write it anyway for this unique law. How does he know that that Nazir ends with a prat? So Gemara says simple. Savala Lazar, the Dorish Mia Veriba. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah goes like the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, which we saw yesterday. Rabbi Elazar holds Chartzanim and Zag is not a prat. He holds that the rule applied here is Mia and Riba. Mia meaning a less inclusive term, like wine, vinegar, grapes, raisins, and a more inclusive term like Kolash Yaitz Megef and Yayin. And according to that understanding of the framework that we typically call prat to klal prat to klal, that understanding allows the miyut, the less inclusive term, to define the more inclusive term. So therefore, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah can fit very well with Rabbi Elazar. In other words, they don't hold the prat to klal prat. We'll soon see the Gemara. They actually do hold the prat to klal prat, but this is not an example of prat. This is not an example of things. Our Gemara has nothing to do with prat to klal. This derivation from the laws of Nazir is not in the category of prat to klal prat. Rather, it's in the category of mi and riba. Now, typically, we paskin lahalacha. We don't hold that mi and riba is the definition of the framework referring to what we call klal prat. We would say that prat to klal, we say klal moisef ala prat, meaning there's no derivation at all. Again, according to us, this is the traditional way that you learned until you heard of miyad and riba. If you heard of prat klal, meaning a term gives a specific term followed by a generic term, we say that there is no derivation at all. No derivation. We say the klal is in addition to the prat. So the generic term includes everything, and it also includes the specific item listed first. However, if you hold prat or klal as actually to be understood as miyad and riba, then it isn't inclusive. Then it does include things. It is a derivation, and the miyat defines the riba. The miyat defines the more the less inclusive term defines the more inclusive term. Okay. We're together? Yeah.
As much as you can be 6 o'clock.
Okay. Okay. The Ibai is saying another possibility. Kirabanon. He could again. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says Chartzanim and Zag is this unique category. Chartzanim means 2, Zag means 1. If you're eating peels and pits, you need at least 2 peels and 1 pit. And again, obviously, if you remember the Mishnah yesterday, there is a debate whether Chartzan is a peel or a pit, or whether Zag is a peel or a pit, right? But obviously, the traditional understanding is that Chartzan is peels and Zag is pits, and that's how we'll continue to explain this, until we get to that opinion, to explore that other opinion. Okay. So the Gemara says as follows. So Rabbi Elazar could even be with the Rabbanan. Okay. What about the fact that Chartzan and Zag is coming to tell you something specific? The Yitzhak Dayach Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah lichted Rachman Allahayim Chartzan avad Zag ave protein. L'mayach zekasi boser klal shmamina l'minyani l'midayin b'klal prat. Okay. Very simple. I get the whole thing. So you're talking about Chartzanim and Zag. You're saying that that's telling you its own din, right? Its own law that you need to have 2 peels and 1 pit. Fine. So listed in the first pasuk, the first pasuk gives all the specifics. It says wine, strong wine, vinegar, grapes, and raisins. It should also say Chartzan and Zag. Why is it misplaced? Why is the prat listed after all the previous prat? Must be it's coming to tell you prat to klal prat. So it could be that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah would work also with the rabbis. Okay. Maybe if it's afterwards, maybe it's not coming to tell you Chartzan and Zag at all. So in other words, the fact that we're saying it's coming to tell me prat to klal prat, so maybe it's not coming to tell me this unique thing of 2 peels and 1 pit. Samar says if that was the case, it's all coming to tell me the prat to klal prat. In other words, it's true that you're right. It's listed out of order to tell me prat to klal prat. Right, because it could have been listed in the first category of pratim, of specifics, of wine, grapes, vinegar. Torah chose to put it at the end. Okay, that clearly tells me prat to klal prat. Maybe that's the only thing it tells me. That can't be either. Why? Because the Torah should have said mechartzin va'ad zag or mechartzanim va'ad zagin. You should use plural for both words, or you should use singular term for both words. Why does the Mishnah switch? Why does the Torah switch from a plural to a single? Chartzanim, plural, peels, to zag, singular pits. Must be coming to tell me also a separate law, 2 peels, 1 pit at a minimum. If you're in the habit of eating peels and pits. Okay. It only gets more difficult now. Okay. Shema Min, the Midrash by Klal Prat. So Shema Min is coming to tell me 2 things. Number 1 is tell me Klal Prat, and number 2 is to tell me Shnei Chartzanim and Zag. Okay, two peels and a pit. Okay. I'll do my best here. It's not cheesy Gemara. This Gemara is until the end of today. This is we're out of Nazir now. Okay, gone from Nazir. Now we're talking about Prat Uklal again. Let's just go through this slowly here. We'll go with 3 categories here. It's actually really 5 categories. It's more, it's 6 categories. Okay. Let's go with the traditional first. So until now, anyone who says Shmuel every day, they know that there's 3 generic rules. One is called, this one we have not discussed yet, it's called Prat Uklal. I'm sorry, the opposite, Klal Uprat. You have a generic term followed by a specific term. What's the rule? Ein bechlal elamash beprat. It's not a derivation. There's no derivation. There's nothing included here. There's no inclusivity or, it's very simple. If you have a generic term followed by a specific term, the generic term is absolutely limited by the specific term. Ein bechlal, there's nothing in the generic term, elamash beprat, unless it's included under the specific rubric. That's number 1. We haven't seen that yet. Not really going to see it. We're not really going to see it on its own. Okay. I should say this. We're actually 8 categories here, to be more precise. Okay. Second category. This is what we just seen. That's called a prat uklal, a specific term followed by a generic term. What's the rule? Very simple. There's nothing that's included. Nas klal moisif al haprat. Right. The klal includes everything plus whatever the specific term was. It's not a derivation. You're not adding things. It's very simple. You have a prat and you have a klal, and it's 2 separate things. Okay. Then we have 2 categories. The most common one is called the klal uprat uklal, a generic, a specific followed by a generic, and a prat uklal uprat, a specific, a generic, and then a specific again. Okay. We'll discuss the differences at the end of today, hopefully. But for now, it should suffice to say that they're roughly similar. Okay, and the rule is as follows. Again, whether it's a generic, specific, generic. So you have 2 generics at the end and a specific in the middle. Or if you have a specific in the middle of generic. In either scenario, the typical rule is going to be as follows: take the generic term and sort of use a lowest common denominator. Make an inclusive package that includes the specifics. Right. So, for example, by Nazir, we said look at all the specifics, find the common denominator, and say that the generic is a basket of all those specifics. Roughly, they work roughly the same. There's a minor difference. We'll get to it later. Well, we won't get to it. I'll tell you to you now. It's not a big deal. In general, this is very logical. If you think the Torah says 2 specifics and a generic, you think the generic adds 1 item. It's got to be still much more closer to the specifics because you have 2 sets of specifics. Whereas in the opposite scenario where you have 2 generic terms and in the middle you have a specific term, then you say the opposite. You say that there's 2 generic terms, so it should be a more expansive category. Sort of makes sense. It's more inclusive than having only one generic term in between 2 specific terms. Those are 4 categories. That's the traditional. That's probably what you say in davening every day. And that's the traditional way of understanding. Okay. There's another opinion in Shas through our Talmud. It's really 2 sets of opinions. The first set of opinions, they're very similar. There's the small set of opinions, and there's one opinion that uses 2 sets of rules. One's called Miyat and Reba and Miyat, and there's another one that adds another 2 rules to that set. So again, we're working in the same framework of generic and specific terms. But instead of understanding it as generic and specific, we're calling it more and less inclusive. Again, it's the same exact words. It's the same framework. It's just depending on how you define it, it depends on what type of rules you follow. So the first set of rules is called miyut and riba. A miyut and riba means a lesson. This is the equivalent to prat u'klal. Instead of saying prat u'klal is not a drush at all, we say that actually it's both, it's klal and prat. In the traditional understanding, in the miyut and riba understanding, say no. The less inclusive term minimizes the more inclusive term in some way. Okay. We should put a thing and graph a few, because a lot of this is because this actually aligns pretty nicely with prat to klal prat, except that there is no prat. In other words, the amount of addition that traditionally the rabbis would add in prat to klal prat is actually applied to miyut and riba. And the same is true of riba and in the scenario of riba and miyut, right? Of riba and miyut, meaning you have a expansive category followed by a limiting category. It's more limited, so it would be like prat to klal prat in the traditional sense. Again, so miyut and riba is like klal prat to klal, and riba and miyut is like prat to klal prat in the traditional sense of understanding. And then you have two more categories, which would be riba miyut riboy. That's roughly the equivalent of klal prat to klal, and miyut riba miyut, which is roughly the equivalent of prat klal or prat. And the idea is, in this opinion, riba miyut riboy includes almost everything. You take out the most minor insignificant thing, because it's almost entirely an inclusive category, since there's so many inclusions. Riba is two ribas on either sides, and miyut, riba, and miyut is only a little bit less than that. Again, two things that are sort of far flung. Okay, that's roughly the Gemara. Now, there are opinions that hold that instead of klal prat and prat klal, we use miyut, riba, miyut. But at the same time, they still agree that when you have a prat klal prat or a klal prat klal, you go with those laws, and you don't apply the laws of miyut, riba, miyut, riba, or miyut, riba, miyut. Okay, so let's see the Gemara now. Okay, so now the Gemara presumes that Rabbi Lazar here that says miyut and riba and miyut still agrees to prat to klal prat, and klal, and the other way klal prat to klal.
Rabbi, page position check, please.
Hold on one second. Give me a second. I have to find it myself. Okay, a little more than halfway down the page. First one on the line is vizag. Verbalizar darish miyut v'riba. According to Rabbi Lazar, that learns miyut and riba. So prat uklal prat minole. How does he know this rule of prat uklal prat? Because Rabbi Lazar's opinion, like we said before, is that he holds a miyut and riba miyut, but he also holds a prat uklal prat. So if Nazir is not the example of prat uklal prat, what is the example? So the Gemara gives three examples. These are, I would say, these are more borderline scenarios. This is typically not when you go through Talmud and you find an example of prat klal prat, and we'll have more coming up, and in Kedushin there's a few good ones, and I believe in some of the Bava Kama, I think also very good prat klal prat, like much more classical, like traditional structure. These are much more borderline structures. So Amar Bavu gives, so the Gemara will give three examples. Bavu gives the first example. Nafkle mehaikra. This is an example. So okay, this one, the first one was actually a pretty traditional one. Somebody, we're talking here about somebody giving his friend something to watch. Okay, so he gives him, what does he give him? He gives him specific things here. Chamor, a donkey, a shar, or an ox, a seh, or an animal. Prat, those are all specifics. V'chol behema, or any animal. That's a much more inclusive term. That's a generic term. That's a klal. Lishmar, to watch. This is a more specific term. This is not a typically you want more specific than a word like lishmar. Lishmar means with a specific focus to watch. 1 second. I think Taisus might even have it more specific than that. Hold on. Oh, I'm sorry. Taisus has a much better way to read it. Okay, I'm going to reread it. I'm going to read it again. Taisus has a much clearer way to read it. Okay. If somebody gives his friend something to watch, it's one of these specific things: a donkey, an ox, or sheep. The kol, or anything. And then the limiting term is behema, an animal, lishmor, to watch. So behema lishmor is a much more specific term. It's an animal. So that would be prat to klal prat, get to donal ke'ena prat. We learn from here that you watch an item, right? The Torah says, let's say you lose the item. What's the law? Shvuas Hashem tiyeh ben shneim. You have to make an oath. So we learn from this prat to klal prat only certain items. For example, if you tell your friend to watch your house, and your house is stolen, let's say, by gunpoint, right? Or it's burnt down or something like that, your friend does not need to swear because it's not included in the category. A house is it's connected to the ground, and it's not movable. It's karka. As opposed to all these items that are metallic. These are movable items. So that's what's excluded by this prat to klal prat. Okay, that's one example. Rava Amar, Rava says, again, these are not great examples of prat to klal prat, but let's see them. Nafle mehai kra. We learn it from this pasuk. This is talking about somebody who's bringing karbonis, I believe. Yeah, someone was bringing a carbon oil. Okay, first thing is v'im min. The word min means from, and it's always a limiting word, right? If I tell you I'm bringing from my sheep, that means not all sheep, right? Min hatzain, min is always a limiting word because you can only bring some of them, meaning there are some categories that are excluded. Prat. Hatzain, sheep, that's the more inclusive category because it's not some sheep, it's all the sheep. Okay. Klal, that's a generic term. Kvasim v'izim. So this kvasim and izim means I don't know how to say this right. There's lamb and what's a baby goat called? Also lamb, I think. A baby goat, a kid. There we go. Thank you. Kids. So kvasim and izim, the Talmud understands it to mean lambs and kids, which is a limiting factor, right? Because tzayin is sheep. Sheep could be children, they could be adults. But now we're saying kvasim v'izim, it's lambs and kids, meaning it's babies, under a year old. Chazer or parat. Prat to klal prat. Prat. It's got to be similar to the prat, and we learn here it has to be only 1 year old, and it can't have a moment, etc. Okay, Tosfos has two versions here, but this is the more logical version. I'm sorry, I take it back. The version that I have an easier time understanding. Okay. Amar le Rabbi Yehudah min Iskarta l'Rava. Rabbi Yehudah min Iskarta offers a third alternative. V'leilef min hadein kra. Let's give another example. Min prat. From is min have. We learn also about an animal for carbon. Min is a specific term. Habehema, an animal, is a klal, right? Bakar v'tzayin, a bull or a sheep. Chazer parat. That's another example of a prat to klal. Prat yatadon al ke'ena prat. We have an example where the laws are just like where you have a prat to klal prat. It's got to be an animal. It cannot be a wild animal. That's the message here. Min means from. Min always means not all animals. From all the animals, you're going to bring some. Okay. Then you have habehema, all the animals, right? That could be any type of animal, any type of kosher animal. That's a klal. That's a generic. And then the specific term is bakar v'tzayin, ox and cattle and sheep. That's a specific term. Chazer parat, prat to klal prat, prat. The message here is, don't bring a chaya. Only bring domesticated animals. Don't bring a wild animal. Amarlei min hai like a. This is not a good source. Ime hasam, because if you bring this source, havamina, I would think habehema. When the Torah says behema, chaya b'chlal behema. 1 second. In other words, the word animal includes also a wild animal. So it's as if the Torah wrote domesticated and wild. It's not a good source. He responded incredulously, chaya b'chal behema? Do you mean to say that chaya is part of the word behema? Behema doesn't mean that. Haksib, bakar v'tzayin. V'havale prat klal prat. V'yat don al ke'ena prat. One second. So he says no. He says it seems obvious that chaya is not obviously part of behema. A wild animal is not necessarily included. The word behema typically always means domesticated. It's not just part. It's not animals, domesticated animals. So therefore, it's not included. And yeah, you're right. There is a place to darshan here, klal prat to klal, and to exclude wild animals. So that's what the Gemara concludes. Okay. Where is another example that in other words, the Gemara is asking a generic question here, appropriate. How do we know that the specific instance of prat to klal prat is a valid way to explain the Torah? Where do we find the Torah? Where's the clearest example, the most classical scenario? In other words, what's the source of all sources of prat to klal, prat to klal, prat to klal? So Gemara says as follows. This is one of the most traditional sources. Bava Kama and Erevin. Tanya v'netzata hakesed b'chol asher sava nafshacha klal. Okay, so what are we talking about here? We're talking about Ma'aser Sheni. What's Ma'aser Sheni? Every first, second, fourth, fifth year of Shemitah, 10% of your produce gets set aside as Ma'aser Sheni. It needs to be brought to Jerusalem. What can you purchase with it? So the Torah says, v'netzata hakesed. If you take this, so what happens is most people can't bring it to Jerusalem. They can't actually bring the stuff is going to spoil, right? So what do? You redeem it on a coin. So you have a bag of coins, you bring it to Jerusalem. What do you do with it? If you take the money, and anything that you desire, that's clearly a klal, generic term. With animal, with cattle, sheep, wine, strong wine or beer. What is that? Clearly, that's a prat. That's specific. And anything that you so desire. What's that? Chazar klal. You went ahead and put a klal. Klal or prat to klal. It's the clearest example of a klal or prat to klal. Iyatadon elakena prat. So what's the rule? We're gonna take the pratim, the specifics. We're gonna turn them into a basket, into a lowest common denominator, and we'll decide to say that the klal, the most generic term, is not the most generic term. It is a generic term that encapsulates all of the pratim, all the specifics, plus a little bit. Just like the specifics, mefurish, primi, privigdule karka, these are products that reproduce from each other, right? Animals reproduce from each other. Wine, grapes reproduce from each other. You take a cutting and you plant it, okay? Ugdule karka, and they're considered they're in touch with the ground, so to speak, right? So animals consume, they eat the grass, they eat from the ground, and obviously plants grow from the ground, okay? So therefore, anything in that category is included. What's excluded? Water. Can't buy bottled water. Can't buy salt. Right? And you can't buy fish. No salmon. Okay, why would you want salmon? You get meat anyway. Right? Nobody knows. No one would know. Okay.
How about two vegetarians?
Okay. Afkal premium pre. We do like karka. Okay. Samichti. Let's examine this. Klal proto klal and proto daininon. We say that it's like the prat, that's like the specifics. Klola basar mayahani. What does the last klal come to include? Ahani lo isufe kol domile. It includes things that are similar to the prat. V'su prat klal uprat and haprat aninale. Similarly, if you have a specific, generic, a specific, what do we say? We say that and haprat aninon. We say that the generic term is limited like the specifics, right? Prata basar mayahani. What's the purpose of the last specification, the last specific category in prat to klal prat? Ilav prat, if not for the last prat, like remember, like hartzanim and zag, havamina natsa klal ma'isef ala prat. We would say that there's no derivation at all. It's a prat and a klal. Umechti. Train klali uprata, utrain prata uklala. If you have klal or prat to klal, or you have prat to klal or prat. And prat to daininon, you say it like the prat. Ma'e kabeni yaveni. What's the difference between a klal or prat to klal and a prat to klal or prat? Right? This is the question I raised earlier. You have two generic terms with a specific term in the middle, or two specific terms with a generic term in the middle. In both instances, we're saying the specific terms encapsulate the generic term. They limit it. What's the difference? So there's a difference. The ilu tart and klali prota. In a case of two klalim, two generic terms, we say that even if it's similar in only one way, in other words, two klalim, two generic terms, it's a much more expansive category, right? Whereas I feel Trey prati klala, but if you have two specific terms followed by a generic term, ika prata the dummy mishneh tzadam marbinan bechatzad loy marbinan. In a scenario of two pratim and a klal, it's got to be similar in two ways. Now, I'm sure you're asking me, what about the fact that Ma'aser Sheni was a klal prata klal, and we gave two similarities. We said it has to be pre ugdule karka, right? It has to reproduce, and it has to eat or grow from the ground. It's two factors. It's a klal prata klal. Taisa's question. Taisa says they really consider the same thing. Okay, whatever. It's a separate discussion. But in general, this would be the rule. Let's examine this. Prat uklal, not a klal meisef ala prat. Ves Rabbi kol mili. If you have a prat and a klal, the klal includes everything. We said the klal prat followed a specific term followed by a generic term. It includes both categories, specific and a generic term. It's not a derivation. Umiyat v'riba nami, and in the scenario of miyat and riba, nami riba hakol, we include. In a scenario of miyat and riba, also we include everything. But it's Rabbi Kalmili, we add everything. My ekabein miyat v'riba leprat klal. What's the difference between miyat and riba and prat klal? So the Gemara says ikka as follows: the ilu prat klal. In a case of prat klal, marbin afilu olam v'lulavin. We include everything, including the woods, right? Because in other words, if we have a prat, a specific term. Wine, grapes, vinegar, raisins. And then we have a klal generic term, anything that comes out of a vine. If the Torah didn't say the last specification of peels and pits, we would say that anything that comes out of the vine includes everything, including the woods. Whereas if it's meat and riba, then we include the soft parts. The all in here means, Taisus explains, means the woods. It doesn't mean the leaves, because the leaves are actually included. Right. Remember, according to Rabbi Lazar, if you eat the grape leaves, you're liable. Similar if you eat the soft branches.
Mm-hmm.
But if you eat the wood, you're not liable, because that's already a limitation. The Mia puts a limitation on that riba. Okay. Tomorrow we get to a very, very fundamental sugya that deals with a lot of, not an easy one, but it deals with a lot of. It's one of the precursors to the laws of Basar V'Cholav.